Confirmation bias, seeking out and giving more weight to evidence that supports what you already believe, while holding contrary evidence to a higher standard. This isn't just passive, it's an active search. In a classic 1960s experiment, psychologist Peter Wasson asked participants to find the rule behind a sequence of numbers like 2, 4, 6. Most people tested sequences that would confirm their initial guess, such as 8, 10, 12, rather than trying to disprove it with something like 7, 11, 13. In the real world, this looks like someone who only reads news sources that align with their political views, like a Fox News viewer ignoring a negative story about a Republican while heavily scrutinizing a negative story about a Democrat. Or it's the investor who only seeks out positive news about a stock they already own, ignoring warning signs. While powerful, some researchers suggest it's not always about actively seeking confirmation, but sometimes about how we interpret ambiguous information to fit our existing worldview. Hindsight bias. Once you know the outcome of an event, the past often feels like it was always going to happen that way. It's the feeling of "I knew it all along." Psychologist Baruch Fischhoff demonstrated this in a 1975 study where participants were asked to predict outcomes of historical events, like President Nixon's 1972 visit to China. After being told the visit had happened, participants consistently reported that they had assigned a much higher probability to it beforehand than they actually had. You see this everywhere from sports commentary after a major upset, where announcers will explain exactly why the underdog was destined to win, to investors looking back at a market crash, believing they saw the signs all along. This bias can make it harder to learn from history, as failures are reinterpreted as unavoidable and successes as obvious. While strong, some research suggests it's not simply knowing the outcome, but also a reconstructive memory process where we selectively recall information that fits the narrative we now have. Survivorship bias. This occurs when you draw conclusions only from the cases that made it through a process, because the failures are no longer in the dataset to be counted. During World War II, statistician Abraham Wald famously applied this to aircraft armor. Military engineers initially suggested reinforcing parts of planes that showed the most bullet holes. Wald, however, argued the opposite. The bullet holes on the returning planes showed areas where the plane could take damage and still fly. The planes that didn't return were hit in other critical areas, so the armor should go where there were no bullet holes on the returning planes. In modern life, this explains why we hear so many success stories from entrepreneurs or self-help gurus. We only see the ones who made it, not the thousands who tried and failed, creating a distorted view of the actual odds of success. Many old buildings still standing today seem robust, but we rarely consider the countless others that have long since crumbled or been torn down. Availability heuristic. This is a mental shortcut where you judge how likely something is to happen by how easily an example comes to mind. Your brain tracks memorability rather than actual frequency. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman famously showed this in a 1973 study. They asked people if there are more words in English that start with the letter K or have K as their third letter. Most people guessed words starting with K because those are easier to recall. In reality, there are roughly twice as many words with K as the third letter. A real-world example is the disproportionate fear of flying after a major plane crash. Such an event is highly memorable due to media coverage and emotional impact, leading people to overestimate the actual risk of air travel, which is statistically very low compared to driving. This bias means vivid, easily recalled events, even if rare, can warp our perception of risk and prevalence. Illusory correlation. This bias involves perceiving a relationship between two things that co-occurred a few times memorably, but which aren't actually linked in any meaningful way. Psychologists Lauren and Gene Chapman demonstrated this in the 1960s with studies on clinical psychology. They showed that clinicians, despite evidence to the contrary, often perceived a correlation between certain Rorschach inkblot test responses and specific patient symptoms because these links fit their existing expectations or theories. For instance, a few instances of a paranoid patient drawing eyes might cement a belief in a connection, even if the actual data shows no such pattern. This is the root of many superstitions. Wearing a specific shirt once when your favorite team won might lead you to believe that shirt is lucky, even though its fabric had no bearing on the game's outcome. It's our brain trying to find order in random events, clustering illusion. This is the tendency to see meaningful patterns in genuinely random distributions, simply because true randomness contains more streaks and clusters than people intuitively expect. Classic example comes from basketball. For decades, fans and players believed in the hot hand, the idea that a player who makes a few shots in a row is more likely to make their next shot. However, research by Thomas Jelovich, Robert Vallone, and Amos Tversky in 1985 analyzed thousands of shots from NBA players and found that success rates after a few made shots were no higher than a player's average. The perceived streaks were no more common than what pure chance would predict. We see faces in clouds, or lucky and unlucky streaks in gambling, even though the spin of a roulette wheel or the roll of dice are independent events. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, and sometimes they find patterns where none exist. Fundamental attribution error. This describes our tendency to explain other people's behavior by their character or disposition, while explaining our own behavior by our circumstances. In a 1967 study by Edward E. Jones and Victor Harris, participants read essays either supporting or opposing Fidel Castro. Even when told the essay writers were assigned their positions, participants still largely believed the writers' stated opinions reflected their true attitudes. In daily life, this plays out constantly. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you might assume they are a rude or aggressive person. If you cut someone off, it's likely because you're late, distracted, or didn't see them. If a colleague misses a deadline, you might think they're lazy or disorganized. If you miss one, it's because you had too much work or unexpected emergencies. This bias makes us quick to judge others based on their actions, while giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Actor-observer asymmetry. This bias describes how we attribute the same event differently depending on whether we are the actor or the observer. If you are the person performing an action, you tend to attribute it to situational factors. If you are observing someone else perform the same action, you attribute it to their disposition or personality. For example, if you trip and fall, you might blame the uneven pavement. If you see someone else trip, you might think they are clumsy. A 2006 meta-analysis by Bertram Mal, reviewing decades of research, found that the general effect size for this asymmetry was quite small, close to zero, suggesting it's not as pervasive as once thought for all events. However, Mal noted that the asymmetry does persistently appear when the outcome is negative or unexpected. So, while you might not notice a bias for everyday actions, when things go wrong, we're still more likely to explain our own blunders by external forces and others' blunders by their internal flaws. Self-serving bias. This is the tendency to take internal credit for your successes and assign external blame for your failures, which effectively protects your self-image at the cost of objective accuracy. It's a widespread cognitive shield. In academic settings, students who do well on an exam often attribute their high grade to their intelligence and hard work. Students who perform poorly are more likely to blame the test's unfairness, the professor's poor teaching, or a lack of sleep. In the business world, a CEO might credit their own strategic genius for rising stock prices, but blame market conditions or supply chain issues for a dip. For instance, Elon Musk often credits his vision for the successes of Tesla and SpaceX, while external factors are more often cited for production delays or missed targets. This bias helps maintain self-esteem, but it can hinder learning from mistakes by shifting responsibility away from oneself. Dunning-Kruger effect. This phenomenon describes a classic observation. Low-performing individuals often overestimate their own ability, while high-performing individuals tend to underestimate theirs, relative to their peers. In their 1999 study, David Dunning and Justin Kruger showed that people who scored in the bottom quartile on tests of humor, grammar, and logic skills often estimated their performance to be in the 60th percentile or higher. Conversely, top performers slightly underestimated their relative rank. However, a significant caveat has emerged. The autocorrelation critique, notably from Edward Neufer and colleagues in 2017, argues that the classic chart depicting the Dunning-Kruger effect can appear in randomly generated data. If people generally overestimate their abilities, which is common, and there's measurement error, the statistical relationship between actual performance and perceived rank can create this specific curve, even if there's no unique psychological mechanism beyond general overconfidence. This doesn't mean incompetence never leads to overconfidence, but it questions the specific shape of the widely cited graph. Halo effect. This bias occurs when one positive trait, often a superficial one like physical attractiveness, bleeds into unrelated judgments about a person's competence, honesty, or intelligence. Psychologist Edward Thorndike first coined the term in 1920 after observing how commanding officers rated soldiers. If an officer perceived a soldier as physically fit, they were also more likely to rate that soldier highly on traits like intelligence and leadership, even without specific evidence. More modern studies, such as one by Karen Dion, Ellen Burchade, and Elaine Walster in 1972, showed that attractive individuals are often perceived as more intelligent, sociable, and successful. This means a charismatic CEO might be seen as a brilliant business strategist, even if their company's performance is mediocre. Or a well-groomed job candidate might receive higher marks across all evaluation criteria compared to an equally qualified but less polished applicant. Horn effect. This is the inverse of the halo effect. The Horn effect describes how one negative trait contaminates every other assessment of the same person. If you perceive someone negatively in one area, that negative impression can spread, leading you to judge them unfavorably across unrelated attributes, regardless of evidence. For instance, if a public figure is known for one major scandal or gaffe, people might then assume they are generally incompetent, untrustworthy, or unintelligent in all aspects, even those unrelated to the original incident. A colleague who has a reputation for being slightly unorganized might be overlooked for a promotion, not just because of their organizational skills, but because that single negative trait has cast a shadow over perceptions of their creativity, teamwork, and dedication. This bias highlights how a single piece of negative information can disproportionately shape our overall impression of another person. Negativity bias. This bias describes how negative information, events, or experiences carry more psychological weight and influence than equivalent positive ones. It impacts memory, attention, and impression formation. A comprehensive review by Roy Baumeister and colleagues in 2001, titled "Bad is Stronger Than Good," synthesized numerous studies showing this imbalance. For example, people tend to remember criticism more vividly and for longer than praise. One bad customer service experience can outweigh 10 good ones in a customer's overall impression of a company. News organizations often prioritize negative stories like crime, disaster, and scandal because they capture more attention. This bias is thought to be an evolutionary adaptation, as quickly identifying and reacting to threats was crucial for survival. However, in modern life, it can lead to an overly pessimistic view of the world and make it harder to appreciate positive experiences. Optimism bias. This is the systematic tendency for people to expect better than average outcomes for themselves specifically, across a wide range of life events. It's the belief that good things are more likely to happen to you than to others, and bad things are less likely. Taylor-Sherratt's research, including fMRI studies from 2011, has shown how the brain is more responsive to desirable information and less likely to update beliefs when confronted with negative news about the future. For example, most people believe they are less likely to get divorced than the average person, despite high divorce rates, or less likely to develop cancer. In project management, this bias is rampant. For instance, the infamous Big Dig Highway project in Boston was originally estimated to cost around $28 billion in 1985, but by its completion in 2007, the actual cost had ballooned to over $14.6 billion, a classic case of systematically underestimating timelines and budgets. In-group favoritism. This bias refers to the tendency to provide preferential treatment, resources, or positive evaluations to members of one's own group over those of an outgroup. Psychologist Henry Tajfel famously demonstrated this in his 1971 minimal group paradigm experiments. He would arbitrarily assign participants to groups, sometimes based on trivial criteria like their preference for paintings by artists Klee or Kandinsky. Even with these meaningless group assignments, participants consistently allocated more points or rewards to fellow Klee fans or Kandinsky fans, even if it meant giving less to others and gaining no personal benefit themselves. This bias is a powerful driver of group cohesion and loyalty, but also of prejudice and discrimination. You see it in fierce sports rivalries, intense political partisanship where supporters of one party view members of the opposing party with suspicion, or even in workplace dynamics where employees favor colleagues from their own department. Curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it becomes incredibly difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. This makes it challenging to communicate complex information to someone who lacks your background. Elizabeth Newton's 1990 Tappers and Listeners experiment famously illustrated this. Tappers were asked to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song, while listeners tried to guess the tune. The tappers, who had the melody clear in their own minds, vastly overestimated how often the listeners would correctly identify the song. They predicted about 50% accuracy, but listeners only guessed correctly about 25% of the time. This is why experts often explain things poorly. A software engineer might use technical jargon without realizing a non-technical manager won't understand. A professor might assume students grasp fundamental concepts they haven't explicitly covered. The knowledge, once acquired, becomes an invisible barrier to understanding the learner's perspective. Spotlight effect. This is the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice and remember your appearance, mistakes, and behaviors. We often feel like we're constantly in the spotlight, and that everyone around us is paying close attention to our every move. Psychologists Thomas Jelovich, Victoria Husted-Medvec, and Kenneth Savitsky demonstrated this in a 1999 study. Participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, like one with a large picture of Barry Manilow, into a room full of other students. When later asked to estimate how many people noticed their shirt, the participants significantly overestimated the number. In reality, far fewer people paid attention to the shirt than the wearer believed. This bias fuels much of our social anxiety, worrying excessively about a small stain on your shirt, a minor social faux pas, or a less than perfect hairstyle, convinced that everyone noticed and will remember it. Most people are simply too focused on their own internal world to scrutinize yours. Subscribe to Impulse, and the next video is waiting for you on screen right now.